You're right, guys. Share here, Uneven Bounce. Hope you guys are well. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Lawson Naidoo to discuss a topic that's become more and more close to my heart, really. And I'd like to obviously bring someone on to discuss have a conversation with me about it. So I've got Lawson Naidoo here with me today. Just to introduce Lawson to you guys. I've got a brief rundown of his profile. Lawson Naidoo is the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, CASAC, an organisation committed to the principles of progressive constitutionalism, democracy and the rule of law. He has held this position since CASAC's inception in 2010. Lawson is a founding partner of the Paternoster Group, African Political Insights, a consultancy focused on political economy issues in South Africa. He spent many years in political exile in the UK and worked at the ANC mission in London, serving inter alia as a spokesman for the ANC. Lawson, thank you very much for coming on. How are you doing?
Good, very good, thanks. Good to be here.
Oh, so I just need to take that off. Apologies. So I'm check the stream is going okay on the channel. But yeah, so obviously, Lawson, we've had a couple of conversations prior to this this interview here. As I mentioned before, the title of the video is about why transformation is necessary in South African cricket. The reason why I wanted to have a conversation is because for the last week or so, we've seen the sports minister, I think it's arts and culture in South Africa, make some quite strong comments towards the upper management of CSA being, I think, a little bit too white for his liking. And obviously wanting more players of colour, so people of colour to be there. Obviously, it's been rebuked by Chris Nzanzi, feeling like people are there on merit, obviously with Graham Smith, Boucher, Callis, etc. But obviously, I've been reading a lot online about the comments on this and why. I feel like people are a little bit uneducated, dare I say ignorant, but certainly uneducated as to the history of the country and why transformation is absolutely necessary in South Africa, and especially sport. So yeah, I mean, Lawson, I mentioned before, I wanted to do kind of a brief overview of kind of the background of the country, but I think we can get into that from a cricketing perspective, during the conversation. I mean, first of all, I'd say, Lawson, what do you think about those comments made by the sports minister last week?
Well, I think they're entirely understandable in the context that, over 25 years since the dawn of democracy in South Africa, nearly 30 years since South Africa's readmission to international cricket in 1991. And if you look at the higher echelons of Cricket South Africa in terms of certainly its management structure, perhaps not so much the board, which is still representative of the provinces and the like, and is quite transformed. But the upper, the senior management structure that is in place with an acting chief executive in Jacques Fall, director of cricket in Graham Smith, the national coach Mark Boucher, and the batting consultant Jacques Callis, and the bowling consultant, spin bowling consultant Paul Harris. That's quite a, and then you've got Enoch Nkwe, who's the former interim coach, who's now the understudy to Mark Boucher. So it's the only senior black figure within that grouping. And I think it's that has prompted the remarks from the Minister of Sport. I think it's a sense of exasperation that we've not really come very far in almost 3 decades of unity in cricket in South Africa. So it's an expression of that frustration and saying, surely we should be doing better than that.
Do you share those sentiments? I mean, do you feel like, obviously, I know they've got Justin Ontong and Charles Langeveld there as well, so there is some obviously more representation of colour there. But do you feel obviously with the key? I mean, I think obviously we can appreciate the 3 key positions will be the coach, the president, with Graham Smith, Mark Boucher, and I'm losing I forgot the third person now, with Jack Fall, CEO.
Yeah.
So do you feel at this point of the 2020, as we said before, so remission to almost 30 years, do you think one of those individuals should really be a Black African?
At the very least, one of those ought to be. And I think,
Mm.
I think one also has to look at it from the point of view that they're in a transitional phase, because the CEO of South African cricket, Tabang Moret, has been suspended since December last year. So
Yes,
Jacques
yeah,
Paul
6 months now.
is there is there in an acting capacity. Now, and this is something that one can lay at the door of the board of Cricket South Africa for not having dealt with the Tabang Moret situation more speedily. They'd given themselves 6 months to do that, and they failed to do it in that 6 months,
Mm.
which expired a few weeks ago. And there's still no indication as to when that sort of
Been
investigative process
resolved.
will be over, and then so that South African cricket can then move forward. And begin to restructure itself and put people into positions on a permanent basis that reflects the demographics of the country and the demographics of cricket in the country more specifically.
I think provides a really good segue into the next point, Lawson. I mean, you mentioned before about obviously with the schooling system and trying to obviously unearth as well more Black Africans to represent the country. I think that's something that's always I've had a bit of contention with, really, that there can be. I'm not sure the exact demographic of the country now. I'm sure Lawson, you could tell me in terms of the amount of Black Africans there. I think it's over 75%, I believe. So for that reason, for me, it's always been a case of surely there's more people in the state schools and the townships that are capable of playing. I think that's one of the main issues they've had over the last, let's say, 26 years. We go from the first democratic election. Why is the pathway from the school system to the national team been fraught with difficulty from an outside perspective, just considering the amount of people who have not come from a township, from a state school, as opposed to private school? Because it seems to me that the majority of the Black Africans in particular who have played for the Proteas have all come from private schools, I believe, apart from maybe one, is it Mfuneko and Gam? I believe he hasn't. But the rest of the players have, Bavuma and Dr. Kwayo and Ngidi and Rabada, etc., have all come from a private school system. So for me, like, they're missing a trick or two there, surely, as CSA, because there's a huge talent pool there that's not been tapped into. So why is that? Is it? I believe Gary Curtin's got academies scattered around the country, and there's other programs in place as well. But why has it taken 26 years to only find one individual in Ngam? Why is it more of risen to the top?
Well, I think one has to go back to the sort of the history of South Africa under apartheid, when black players were not allowed to be chosen for the national side. There was a white only structure for cricket in the country that had the best facilities. And whilst cricket has always been a popular sport within black communities in South Africa, in the Eastern Cape, in particular here in the Western Cape, in KwaZulu-Natal, there've been strong cricketing traditions and strong cricketing structures, but they never had access to the same kinds of facilities as white cricketers had in the apartheid era, and very little has changed in that regard in the ensuing 26 years or so. So I think it's a lot to do with the facilities that exist, and if you start talking about within the school system, again, there's a huge backlog, and whilst there've been various initiatives, Baker's Mini Cricket, and some of the development programs being run by former cricketers and the like, these are really just scratching at the surface. And what is required is a much greater level of investment in sporting infrastructure in Black African schools in particular. And this cuts across sporting codes. It's not just about cricket, but it's about rugby and football and a host of other sports, hockey and the like. So this is a huge challenge that we face in South Africa, and sport is competing with a whole range of other things in terms of just school infrastructure, provision of libraries and books and computers, to health services, and the whole gamut of social services. So sport often ends up very low down on those lists of priorities, but even despite that, very little has been done. So it's going to take a long time still to begin to unearth players, black players that come through the system in that way from a state school background, as it were. So the vast majority of cricketers that make it through to professional level, whether they even make it through to international level, come through sort of the elite cricket or sports schools that are, still very prevalent in South Africa.
I see. Okay, thank you. I mean, it's a quite great insight and deep insight, especially for people over here in the UK who, I think I said before, I think we're not as knowledgeable. I think it's a case of, I think a viewpoint from the outsider, really, Lawson, has always been, why can't just the best players be picked? Why is there a need to force the issue? Obviously, since 2016, as we know now, there's official quotas in place to have 6 players of colour, no more than 5 white South Africans playing in the team. And obviously now there's a majority now, which is colour, it's been going for longer, obviously, in the franchise system. That hasn't really worked out. I feel like it was initially as we know, it was 2 black Africans per franchise. That got increased to 3. I think around 2013, 2014, it still wasn't, I think, producing the results that they, CEC expected. Or sports minister, government expected in terms of enough representation of colour. So that's why they made it mandatory now, as we know, to have 6 players of colour across the season, which obviously now last year, recently it came out, 2018, 2019, they've reached that target, despite obviously the comments by the sports minister last week. They have now reached the target, but still people can't seem to wrestle the fact that I think people look at the team's fortunes in the most recent past, let's say in the last 5 years. I mean, you could argue that the initiative now to have 6 players of colour has coincided with a downturn of the Proteas in the last 4 years. Would you agree with that, or is it more to do with the players that have left? Or
well, I think there are a number of factors that come into play there. I think if you look at quotas, firstly on its own, quotas in itself can never be a strategy for transformation on its own. It's got to be a short-term measure that tries to fast track a process. But on its own, if you don't have the pipeline coming through from whether it's from schools or clubs or whatever pipeline you have into the professional cricketing system, a quota system in itself is a short-term shock to the system, but it's unsustainable if you don't have that pipeline of players coming through. So that, I think, is a critical part of it. And you've got to look at quotas through that context. And ultimately, in an ideal world, once you've leveled that playing field and created equal opportunities for everyone from a grassroots level, then you don't need quotas anymore, because the best players will surface to the top and they will have had an equal opportunity of doing that. But that's still a long way in the future for South Africa. People point to the fact that the introduction of quotas coincided with the demise of South African cricket, but we went through a period where we lost, half our side, who were world-class cricketers,
champions,
retired within a very short space of each other, and sort of decimated the spine of the team. So you're in a rebuilding process at the moment. You're in a rebuilding process when the domestic game isn't quite as strong as it ought to be, for financial reasons and other reasons. So you're not producing the quality of cricket that we did in the past.
I think obviously in that point you mentioned about the domestic system, the franchise system, I think is one of its weakest points in my history that I've known South African cricket. It's the quality is not that strong anymore as it maybe used to be 15, 20 years ago. I think we've seen that with debutants that have played for South Africa over the last 12 months. For example, Zabir Hamza, who was plundering runs for the Cobras week in, week out. He makes a step up against, obviously, India, then England. And there's obviously a huge gulf in the quality. Now, if you can go back to, obviously, with the fact that you mentioned before, the lack of quality players in the pipeline, which is diluting the quality in the franchise system, that almost brings about the issue of Kolpak as well. It seems like Kolpak and transformation can almost go hand in hand to a certain extent, because not necessarily hand in hand, but they definitely have some connection there. Because obviously, if Kolpak wasn't in existence, then these players to be applying their trade for in franchise cricket. So therefore, obviously the standard's higher and the gulf is obviously less when you make it to the international level. So from that perspective, I mean, with the Kolpak system, I know we've had conversation in the past, Lawson, about this, and the majority of the players, from my perspective, I've mentioned it on this channel before, I don't think they've really missed out that much from people who've left. For example, we say Wayne Parnell, Steve Van Zyl, I think like Andrew Hall. If we go back to more recently, obviously people like Huddersfield Young. These players, I don't believe would
Riley
necessarily made the
Rousseau.
grade. Riley Rousseau, obviously, Riley Rousseau's an interesting one. I think he might have could have been a fixture in white ball cricket. But I think people like Viljoen, etc., I'm not sure they would have necessarily made the grade. Steve Van Zyl, I don't believe at all. Dean Billas, unfortunate for him to be born in the same era as Quinton de Kock. But I think a lot of the players who've gone, obviously the international side, I don't think it's necessarily missing that much. But the franchise system, obviously, isn't it? That's what's affected them.
Well, yeah.
It's what's been affected by
if those players were still playing in South Africa, the quality of our domestic game would be that much higher because of the quality that they bring to it, even though they may not be, regular international players, but and would raise the game at domestic level across the board in South Africa. So the young players that are coming through, when they make the step up from domestic cricket to international cricket, it's not such a big leap because they've been playing a good standard of cricket.
Exactly.
But unfortunately, that's not the case. But the other issue, which is something I mentioned earlier, which is the issue of money, and the lack of money in South African cricket, and globally, the finances of the game have shifted phenomenally in the last 10 years or so in favor of India, and then now India, Australia, and England as the triumvirate that where the money in cricket sits, and therefore South Africa, is losing income, and therefore can't afford to pay the players what they would like to earn, and therefore they're finding these co-pack deals very lucrative financially. And from that point of view, one can't, one can see why they would go and ply their trade in England for 3 or 4 years and earn some money.
So, because of that reason, I mean, the thing is, even if transformation targets weren't in place, and it was literally just simply, irrespective of colour, the best player plays, it wouldn't have really mattered, would it? Because the money on offer in those countries, but obviously particularly England, would still be there anyway. White players who, like Viljoen, etc., even if they were playing for South Africa, do you think then they would have left anyway? Would these players have gone?
Look, I mean that's an impossible question to answer because it would depend on each individual player, what their goals in life were. Some cricketers, see, the true purists would say, well, playing Test cricket is the pinnacle of the game, and that's what I want to do, and the money comes secondary to me. Others will think, well, the money is important, and maybe I might get the odd Test game here or there, but I'm not going to be a fixture. So so you can't make a generalization about it. For each player, it's going to be a different set of factors that determine their decision. But it has had an impact on the game domestically, and that's something we're going to have to live with. And that's why there needs to be more creative mechanisms within the domestic game. As you know, for the last few years, they've been trying to get this T20 tournament off the ground, the Mzansi League. Hasn't really happened. It hasn't really happened as yet. To try and draw in some of the big names from the global T20 circuit. So even if it's only at a T20 level, players are beginning to mingle with some of the top cricketers in the world, and that's not really happening. So it's that failure within domestic cricket to be able to attract those kinds of international draw cards that I think is also a factor hampering the development of our game.
But I mean, I think irrespective of obviously the short-term pain that the domestic cricket is facing right now, I think we're both in agreement, aren't we, Lawson, that it's a necessity. It has to happen. Transformation is here to stay. It has to continue.
Absolutely, it has. And the sad thing is that it shouldn't have taken us 25 years, and we still seem to be in the starting blocks when it comes to transformation in South African cricket. So it's a lot of wasted time for which the administrators have to take responsibility. For not having put the necessary plans in place to make sure that we were much further down the line than we are at the moment. So I think administrators over the years have to take responsibility of that. But again, you've got to look at it within the context of South African society. So we've moved on from apartheid, but we still live in a really, really unequal society. where a school in a Black African township, the facilities that are there, to a school in a white suburb, it's chalk and cheese. And it's those kinds of issues that we are still grappling with in South Africa. It's going to take a long time to overcome some of those. But in the interim, a whole range of other networks need to be put in place. Strengthening club cricket, for example, and in particular club cricket in black areas. And ensuring that clubs in the townships have adequate, proper facilities, so players are playing on proper wickets and so on. And that's not really happening at the level that it needs to be happening. And so there's a whole range of issues like that contribute to where we are in South African cricket at the moment.
I think it's a really good point. Obviously, people watching this don't obviously know really about the club level, especially in township areas, about the facilities available there to encourage people to pick up a bat, pick up a ball, etc., and then obviously play the game and just get involved in cricket. But if the facilities aren't there, then why would you even attempt to take up the sport?
Well, the facilities are one thing, and that's why the sort of the quota system and the transformation issue is so important, because you need to have role models as well to inspire the young people to come through. So right now, every kid in the country, whether they're black or white, wants to be KG Rabada.
Yeah,
it's a fantastic role model to have. I mean, when Makaya Ntini was in his pomp 15 years ago, he was regularly being voted as the most popular sportsman in South Africa. And football is by far the most popular sport in this country. But Makaya still won that popularity contest every year because he was seen as this icon of black excellence.
Poster boy, wasn't it really? Yeah.
And those are the kinds of role models that we need more and more of, those people at the highest echelons of the game. And to say to young black kids that you can make it to the top. If you put your mind to it, and to have those role models there. So yes, we've had obviously we had Makai, we had KG, and then we have had Vernon and Hashim, and Ashwell Prince. So there've been a number of players who've played that role, but not enough.
No, yeah, because I would say actually as well. Obviously, some of the players you mentioned, obviously, let's say KG, again, came from a very wealthy family in Houghton Estate in Joburg, I believe, on the suburbs there. So, but I think the day that you have, or let's say, a consistency of black players coming from townships and making it to the Proteas, I think kids, 8, 9, 10 years old, just starting to get into the sport, they see those guys at the top who've come from where they've come from. I think it's even close to the heart, close to home, and you can really identify with those guys. I'm not saying, obviously, I'm sure they look at KG Rabada, and say, okay, great, look at him, I can be like him, and it is obviously a role model to aspire to. But if you can, people from,
that's you take the case of someone like Tommy Solikile.
Yes,
who came from a township background. Yes, he went to school in Pinelands in a white suburb, but it wasn't a posh, fancy private school. He went into the school in the suburb next door, but he was someone that lived and grew up in the township. And I think had things turned out differently for him, he could have been that role model for township kids, because they would have been able to identify with his background and experience. To a lesser extent, someone like from Sembo has come from a similar background, but went to very different schools.
Ironically, the person who seems to have the most issue with Tommy Solikile at the time was Graham Smith, from memory. I believe he threatened management there, but if he gets picked, and I'm going to resign, etc. And obviously now,
and then there was the infamous situation on that England tour when Boucher got injured with the barrel hitting him in the eye, and
he was Tommy Solikile.
He was the substitute keeper, but didn't get a game, and instead AB
took the bloody gloves. Yeah. I mean, it just showed
that speaks to one of the failures of the transformation process, because that was an opportunity to showcase a black player who, of course, nobody's going to argue that Tommy is as good a batsman as AB, but Tommy's probably the best glove man we've had in the country for many a year.
Yeah, I think I was like South African's version of Jack Russell, because his averages, I remember, was in his 20s, early 20s, I believe. I think he played for the Lions, from memory. I think it was at
the end of his career, but
I think actually, if you think about Solikile and certain maybe players of colour that have played from previous times. You think about the issue with Justin Ontong and Jack Rudolph. I don't want to talk. Philando is obviously a wonderful player, and the 2015 kind of incident, World Cup semi-final. Not so much that, but I think it's actually, I think the proof's in the pudding. Actually, I think the idea of obviously a Solakile now making the squad, I don't think would necessarily happen. What I'm trying to say is, I feel like the players of colour that are playing now are in and around the Proteas setup are there on merit. If you look at the players that are there, Pepper Kwai, Ngidi, Rabada, Bavuma, they're all there on merits because of their ability. I don't see any question marks like there was of a Solakile, because I think it's fair to throw some criticism at that selection and say, well, does it really just justify his position on this tour in 2012, the South Africa, the English tour? Whereas I think now, every player of colour that, from my perspective, that plays for the Proteas is there on merit. And I think that's actually lost. And I think that's actually showing that the policies that have been put in place by CSA are actually working, because they are finding a nucleus of quality players who are of colour.
No, absolutely. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. The problem I have is that we don't have depth. So we have those handful of players who are there, yes, on merit. They're good enough. But where's the next layer? Is it really there? And that's where I think we have a problem with that layer that should be pressurizing all of those players for their places. That pressure is not there because we don't have that next generation coming through.
Well, hopefully, if obviously some of these guys return, like Harmer and Abbott and Olivier, etc., return, then we'll see obviously a higher standard of cricket, and then maybe we'll see some of these players come out and stick their place. I mean, people like Mwetu and Tony Zulzi, these guys.
Yeah, well, I think I think the other thing that's gonna be a big factor in development of black cricketers in South Africa is the domestic coaching setup. So we've got people like Jeffrey Toyana, Ashwell Prince here coaching at the Cobras in the Cape. So you're getting black coaches coming through with. Black players will be able to identify with them. They'll be able to identify much better with black players and create a more, convivial atmosphere for the development of those players in future. I mean, I think people like Temba have spoken about the influence that someone like Jeffrey Toyana had on him and in his career in terms of understanding him much better than any of his other coaches did. And I think so that's part of the setup, and so that's why I say this has got to be seen at a broader level than just the players that are coming through into the national teams. What does the transformation of the structure of South African cricket as a whole look like? Because you can't look at it just in the silo of the national team and ignore everything else that's been happening. And that's unfortunately a lot what we've been doing for far too long.
So where do you think that was on policy? The rugby team, the Springboks, won the World Cup last year. Where have they succeeded where CSA have failed?
Well, look, I mean, I think there are, a couple of things. We've been blessed with some, again, a number of very talented players at the same time, coming through at the same time into the same team. But if you look at the domestic structure of cricket, of rugby, we've got black players coming through in quite significant numbers. But again, perhaps not enough to create a real depth of talent, but it is coming through, and I think rugby has focused a little bit more and has had less of the tension and the instability that has afflicted cricket at an administrative level. So I'm not saying it's without its problems. They have and still have problems, but it's been much more stable administrative environment in which the franchises have been able to develop their games, and they're much more autonomous at a franchise level in any case in rugby compared to cricket.
Is the management of rugby much more progressive in their thinking? Because for me, it's from an outsider perspective, South African rugby is inherently an Afrikaner sport. It's obviously deep in their culture, and then obviously we go back to the apartheid rule, and then now obviously to be led by a black African to win the World Cup. I mean, it's a phenomenal story if you think about it. If you went back 50 years and said this is going to happen in 2019, people said you're having a laugh. It can't even envision something like this. So I just think, like, yeah, I mean, it's shown transformation, I think, through rugby, and obviously because the origins of rugby as well, and how deeply ingrained it is into South African Africana culture, is that it can work, it can function, and it can be successful.
No, exactly.
So,
I think that's the the best example of it, to say that if you can make transformation a success in rugby, then cricket's got no excuse.
yeah,
And I think cricket administrators need to put up their hands and admit that they haven't done as well as they should have done.
Great. Okay, Uncle Lawson, thank you very much for that. We've obviously almost hit half an hour, so I'm going to wrap it up. So, guys, I wanted to just say we actually had a few more points to discuss, Lawson and I here. But I think we'll obviously, as I mentioned in the title, as part one. So we thought it was best, Lawson and I, to really to maybe do 2 or 3 of these to kind of like really get into depth rather than scratch the surface and everything over the course of 45 minutes. Just try and get into the various topics around transformation over maybe 2 or 3 parts. So yeah, that's it from us, guys. If you like the content, please do like the video, share, comment, also subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one. All right, cheers.
Cheers.